Buonasera a tutti. Sono Manuel Scortichini, un assegnista di ricerca di questa scuola di architettura e design di Ascoli PIceno, e questa iniziativa, dal nome editoria&progetto, tratta un ciclo di 17 incontri che avranno luogo da dicembre 2024 a luglio 2025, durante la quale avremo l'opportunità di conoscere diversi autori di chiara fama, come l'ospite di oggi, Dietrich Neumann, docente di storia e architettura moderna presso la Brown University di Providence in America, e autori della nostra scuola. Quindi sarà un'occasione per gettare un ponte tra la nostra facoltà e la città di Ascoli, per dibattere un po' su quelli che sono i nostri temi di ricerca, da disegno industriale all'architettura, all'urbanistica, al paesaggio. Quindi un'iniziativa per disseminare quelle che sono le nostre tematiche e per confrontarsi con la cittadinanza. L'incontro di oggi parlerà del libro su Mies van der Rohe, scritto dal professor Dietrich Neumann, quindi una sua rilettura di quella che è l'eredità di questo importante maestro del XX secolo. Poi il mio collega, il professor Giuseppe Bonaccorso, farà un'introduzione più esaustiva. Brevemente voglio ringraziare innanzitutto Eleonora della Rinascita e Yale per aver accolto questa iniziativa, per la loro collaborazione in questa iniziativa, così come in tutte le altre che la scuola solitamente propone. Veramente un bene molto prezioso questa libreria, questo spazio per la città, e da parte della scuola abbiamo un po' l'obbligo morale di sfruttarlo al meglio e partecipare a rivitalizzarlo. Ringrazio il professor Giuseppe Bonaccorso e il professor Carlo Vinti, che purtroppo non è oggi qui con noi, che hanno collaborato con me alla curatela di questo progetto, i partecipanti al comitato scientifico. Alcuni sono oggi qui con noi, come la professoressa Petrucci, Sara Giapolletti e tanti altri. Vi invito al prossimo appuntamento, che sarà a gennaio, 15 gennaio, con Ludovico Micara, che presenterà il suo libro che tratterà di teoria e storia dell'architettura, e lascio la parola a Giuseppe Bonaccorso per un'introduzione all'autore, e subito dopo la parola a Carlo Vannicola per un breve saluto istituzionale. Grazie.
Allora, grazie a Manuel. Quindi cominciamo questa presentazione. Siamo molto felici di avere tra noi per questo primo episodio di questa serie che prevede un po' la presenza ad Ascoli PIceno nella libreria Rinascita, su iniziativa della Scuola di Architettura e Design di Ascoli PIceno, architetti, studiosi di architettura, designer che lavorano nell'innovazione, nella grafica, di una serie cadenziale di appuntamenti dove presenteranno questi ospiti, che saranno diversi, provenienti da aree anche completamente diverse ma affini, presenteranno dei libri dove verranno in qualche modo presentate delle ricerche piuttosto innovative su dei settori su cui si poggia un po' l'esperienza della nostra scuola di architettura. Il primo ospite di questa serie si chiama Dietrich Neumann, l'abbiamo in qualche modo, tra virgolette, selezionato, anzi ci siamo selezionati perché ci siamo incontrati in un convegno qualche mese fa, e abbiamo scoperto che Dietrich aveva una grande passione per le Marche, per la provincia di Ascoli PIceno e per la città di Ascoli PIceno. E poi ovviamente abbiamo parlato anche di contenuti, delle nostre ricerche, e quindi chiacchierando in quel periodo stavamo terminando in realtà 2 libri più o meno nello stesso periodo, e il suo libro era quasi completato, e l'argomento di questo libro ci interessava molto, perché praticamente questo studio di Dietrich è relativo a Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe è considerato, come dire, un architetto, forse uno dei maestri del Novecento, e soprattutto Mies approfondisce e in qualche modo è un po' trasversale a molte discipline che sono all'interno della nostra scuola, quindi al design, conosciamo tutte le sue serie, ai progetti architettonici, e poi anche perché ha progettato negli Stati Uniti, è stato a Chicago per tantissimo tempo, ha progettato in Europa, proviene dalla Germania. E anche il profilo di Dietrich ci interessava molto perché viene dalla Germania, è andato a Göttingen e ha studiato nella TUM, cioè nella Technische Universität di Monaco di Baviera, e i suoi studi sin dall'inizio hanno approfondito argomenti molto vicini un po' alle nostre discipline, perché ha studiato anche a Londra, poi ha fatto il PhD a Monaco di Baviera, e uno degli argomenti relativi al suo studio del dottorato, dico questo perché abbiamo anche dei dottorandi qui presenti nella nostra sala, riguardavano appunto uno studio dei skyscrapers, cioè dei grattacieli in Germania, però se ricordo bene negli anni 20, e anche su questo era un argomento un po' comune, perché per esempio personalmente avevo studiato Giovannoni, che aveva studiato i pettini del cielo, erano tradotti in italiano negli anni 20 sia negli Stati Uniti che in Germania, ma la cosa che più ci interessava poi era anche questo rapporto che lui aveva con l'illuminazione e l'architettura, cioè quello che alcuni architetti, per esempio Mendelssohn, che aveva progettato degli edifici dove c'era un prospetto, come dire, diurno e un prospetto notturno, quindi tutti argomenti che in qualche modo combaciavano un po' con le nostre ricerche della scuola, quindi l'aspetto del design della luce, della tecnologia, dell'elemento della tecnologia che entra nella progettazione architettonica. Tutto questo poi l'ha portato ad analizzare tra le varie cose proprio la figura di Mies, che in qualche modo riassume un po' tutto questo. Però l'idea di portare qui poi il professor Neumann è dovuta pure all'ultimo libro, perché l'ultimo libro dedicato a Mies van der Rohe è un libro veramente importante, pubblicato da Yale, e forse per la prima volta, al di là degli studi precedenti su Mies, Dietrich ha approfondito tutta una serie di materiali anche archivistici che nelle precedenti pubblicazioni erano stati un po' messi in disparte, nel senso le corrispondenze interne, corrispondenze familiari con gli allievi, con chi lavorava nello studio, con i fornitori della tecnologia, e quindi ne emerge una figura e anche un'analisi dell'architettura e degli oggetti di design di Mies profondamente diversificata e sicuramente un po' diversa rispetto alla letteratura geografica che un po' su Mies c'è stato. Come organizziamo questa presentazione? Adesso Dietrich ci presenterà attraverso una breve presentazione con alcune immagini, alcune delle opere significative e chiavi di Mies van der Rohe, e poi dopo faremo un po' di dibattito insieme con un nostro collega di composizione architettonica, di progetto, Gabriele Mastrigli, è sempre della nostra scuola, anche lui possiamo dire un fan di Mies, un profondo studioso di Mies, con cui insieme anche ai presenti in sala possiamo poi scambiare delle opinioni e chiacchierare con l'autore. Grazie.
Buonasera, ringrazio il professor Giuseppe Bonaccorso e Manuel Scortichini per l'invito. Io e anche il professor Carlo Vannicola, e qui Eleonora che ha organizzato il spazio, e io e mia moglie siamo venuti a Ascoli PIceno 2 anni fa per caso, e ci siamo innamorati della città in questo momento, e quando ho incontrato il professor Bonaccorso a una conferenza in Atene, mi ha gentilmente invitato a venire qui per parlare del mio libro nuovo, e è meraviglioso essere di nuovo qui. Purtroppo non parlo abbastanza bene l'italiano per poter tenere la mia conferenza in italiano. Parlerò in inglese, ma ho tradotto in italiano alcune frasi importanti. So I will start here with the title, Complex Simplicity of the architecture of Mies van der Rohe. And this is the cover of my book. And I found online, before I move on, I wanted to read this following quote, which I found from the year 1975, where a British critic wrote, "Can there be a need for yet another book on Mies van der Rohe, who has been more exhaustively written about than any other of the hero figures of modern architecture?" So that was in 75, 50 years ago. And of course, many more books have appeared since. Some by me, of course. I have to go here. Many more books have appeared since. Some by me, but many of my colleagues have worked on Mies. And so I want to show you and talk a little bit about why I thought another book on Mies van der Rohe might be a good idea. This is what I found online. Yale University Press made a little film about the book, and I'll show it to you so you get an idea of what it looks like. Unfortunately, we had hoped there would be some here, but they didn't arrive in time. So it has 450 pages, 450 illustrations, and I think it looks quite nice. It's quite big and heavy, as you can see, and a nice book. I'm very happy with it. So what is different, right? I think in my research I found a number of newly found projects, and I also wanted to emphasize the historical context more than the other books and bring more emphasis onto the voices of contemporary critics. Can you read this? Yes, okay. Okay, perfect. So that was my intention, and I'll just give you a quick overview. Mies's career is very neatly split into two halves. One, when he lived in Berlin, and you see that here. He starts his career with very conventional projects, and then, of course, joins the avant-garde. And you can see, for instance, this famous project for a skyscraper in Berlin, never built, just a building clad in a glass skin, very exciting project. Or this one here for an office building in Berlin. And then, of course, the great triumph of the German pavilion at the World's Fair in Barcelona in 1929. In a way, an almost sort of abstract rendering of a house for the future. And then it's sort of applied version in a villa in Brno in Czechoslovakia then, which is now the Czech Republic. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. And then comes the second half of his career in the United States, where he moves in 1937, becomes director of the architecture school at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and does another series of important projects, in particular the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, and the Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago. All of them become paradigmatic for their building type and are often imitated. And here's Crown Hall, the architecture school that gets finally finished in 1956. Penso che una scuola di architettura bellissima, ma io credo che la scuola di architettura in Ascoli PIceno è meglio.
So kind of you.
It's true. And then, of course, the Seagram building. And finally, the big triumph back to Berlin, where he started with the National Gallery of Art. And of course, he's also known for these sort of sayings that we connect with them, be it less is more, God is in the details, I don't want to be interesting, I want to be good. Right? So I've tried to find an equivalent in Italian. So you all know these sayings probably. So very famous, that he was very good at selling himself through these epithets. And I wanted to also quote this one here. Form is not the aim of our work, but only the result. Form by itself does not exist. Form as an aim is formalism, and that we reject. As I will show you in a second, I think he did not follow his own declaration. He became the most stubborn and most glorious formalist of the 20th century. And here's the Italian version of it, just to make sure you all got it. So let me dive in, I want to talk about two topics quite briefly that are connected with them. One is flowing space, and the other one, structural poetry. And I'll start with the flowing space. For that, I think I will take you back to the Barcelona Pavilion. This exhibition pavilion built only for 8 months in 1929 for the World's Fair in Barcelona. And it was taken down right at the end of the fair, but it was photographed very well by a Berlin photographer, a man called Sacha Stone. And so for many years, all we had were these photographs, 13 photographs that were immensely influential and showed that there was a new approach to space, an open connection of different spatial conditions, and a openness that was really unprecedented. Also a very, luxurious use of materials, as you can see here, onyx and travertine. Of course, this city is rich in travertine, so here it's in the walls and on the floors, and onyx and marble on the walls. And I will show you just a few more images very quickly. Here's the sculpture by Georg Kolbe in one of the two water basins, but it's a very essentialist approach to architecture. A column is almost invisible because it's reflective. It doesn't have any capitals or bases. There's no windows. There's only the absence of walls and glass walls instead of windows. So everything gets brought down to its absolute essence. And the effect of these 13 photographs, very few people had seen the actual buildings, but the 13 photographs by Sacha Stone had an immense influence all over the world. If you look at buildings that look like the Barcelona Pavilion, it's very easy to find them everywhere. In Greece, in California, Richard Neutra here, one of the case study houses, in Australia, in the Midwest, even Frank Lloyd Wright, although he would never admit it, of course, took some ideas from Mies van der Rohe and many others. The success was so great. The book, every architecture history book had a photo of it in it, that finally, when Mies was, the 100th anniversary of his birthday came around, it was decided to rebuild the pavilion, and that's what it looked like under construction. 1985, 86 was his 100th birthday, and so the building was finished then. And it looks like this today. And this is a place where we can actually now explore some of what the contemporaries had said about the building very easily. The idea of this flowing connection of space is very central to many of the writings about the pavilion, and you get a good idea here. I wanted to read you a quote while I walk you through the building, a quote that sort of exemplifies how important that notion of flowing space was for the contemporaries. They gave it more meaning than we do today, because Albert Einstein's theory of space-time continuum was very much on everyone's mind. He had just won the Nobel Prize in physics, and so critics talk about this building as an embodiment of four-dimensional space. Time passes while you experience the flowing space. It's a little far-fetched, but that's what critics said. So the way in which the different rooms, entirely without firm boundaries, flow into each other. Sorry, this should move. It's not moving. Oh, I wonder why. Huh. Well, some of you have seen it. I'm sorry, it doesn't seem to have caught on with the film clip. The other clip worked, though. I'll read it to you anyway. So imagine the camera moving through the space. The way in which the different rooms, entirely without firm boundaries, flow into each other, and the entire building opens itself up towards the outside, is without parallel in the entire field of architecture. The pavilion was based on spatial flow and spatial fusion, and thus on a temporal process, even independently from a viewer's experience. In short, four-dimensional space moving with time. This is a critic at the time, Walter Rietzler, and he was referencing Albert Einstein, four-dimensional space moving with time, right? The connection of time and space. So that was quite interesting for me to see. And I wanted to add one more quote from Mies in that same article, which I had quoted before, where he talked formalism we reject. He also said, Baukunst ist immer raumgefasster Zeitwille, nichts anderes. So architecture is always expressing the spirit of its age, nothing else, he would say. I wanted to come to my second half and talk a little bit about structural poetry and take you to the Farnsworth House outside of Chicago in Plano, Illinois, where Mies did something really extraordinary. He rethought how a building could be constructed. And this building, as some of you know, was built near a river as a country house for a doctor, Mrs. Farnsworth. And Mies had the opportunity of putting the building a little further away from the river on a hillside, but he refused. He wanted it here because he wanted to lift the building up from the ground. It looks so much more elegant that way, right? And of course, he had all kinds of consequences to deal with. But I wanted to show you in a set of images what is so fascinating about it, what Mies focused on. A glass box on stilts, and he focused on this particular detail. The glass house seems suspended, the critics wrote at that moment, as if it was held by magnetic force. And many of you are architects. If you look at this detail, and it took me a long time to figure it out, if you look at this detail, there is an I-beam from the foundry, and it's somehow attached to the steel rim that holds the roof, holds the floor, holds the little terrace, but you cannot see how it is attached. You don't see any welding seams, you don't see bolts or screws, so this is what you should see here. Bolts and screws or cordone di saldatura, but you don't see it. It's magic. Right? So when we look a little closer, we'll find that Mies did something very unusual and very extraordinary. He went very far to hide the construction, to make the form different from what it's actually doing. And what he ended up doing was look at this, you don't see any of this, right? It's just glued on, as if it was super glue, just attached it, but of course it's impossible. So if you look very, very closely, you'll find there are little indentations here. Sorry. Can you see them? There's a little bit of a shadow. And he used a very new technique. It was very complicated. A technique, and I hope I got the translation right. Saldatura a spina or saldatura dei fori, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes.
So the way it works is that you have to have holes in the I-beam, so like this, pre-drilled holes, and then you go in with your torch and you attach, you add a little additional metal and you put it together, and then you have a tight connection. And then you grind it all down and you paint over it, and then you can't see anything. Magic, right? But that is not structural honesty, it's structural poetry, structural magic. He went very far to make that. Of course, I would claim that there are a lot of disadvantages. It's very complicated. He was out in the countryside, very far away from electricity, anything. He had to bring in the equipment and create this connection. Very expensive. And poor Mrs. Farnsworth paid a fortune for this house. And of course, it's also an uncertain connection, because it's a craft, right? You don't know how hot it got, how far the connection is embedded. It's a little uncertain. But that's what he did, and I think it's really quite interesting. And I wish I could say that Mies gave the same amount of attention to other aspects of this house. And he didn't. So here are some of the problems with the house. Mrs. Farnsworth moved in, and of course there was no sun protection. You have a glass box, it's like a greenhouse, right? It got hot and sweltering in the summer, and it got cold in the winter. There was no air conditioning, no mosquito protection. The roof leaked basically in the first rain, and the heating created soot, little clouds of black dust that spread all over the house. The fireplace only worked when the door was open because it needed to draw air and you were in a hermetically sealed glass box, right? So, which is counterproductive. If it's winter and you have a fireplace, you want it to warm up and not open the door. Oh, I forgot actually, I forgot to put in another one. In the winter also, when it was warm inside and cold outside, you would have a lot of condensation water running down all the glass. It's obvious, right? And there was regular flooding because he had decided. So here's just in Italian the same that I just explained. And of course, he had put the house next to the river because he wanted it to look beautiful and elegant and hovering in midair. And of course, 5 times it looked like this, a total catastrophe. Once the water really went inside and destroyed everything inside, had to be completely rebuilt. Mrs. Farnsworth sold it in 1972. She almost doubled her investment. She had paid $70,000, which was a lot at the time. In fact, she was charged more than Mies charged the developer for the Lakeshore Drive apartments. More for this one house. Makes no sense to me, but that's what happened. So she paid a lot of money, and she finally sold it to Peter Palumbo, who put in air conditioning, made it livable, and repaired everything after the flood, and used it occasionally as a weekend house. He's still around. He's a British real estate tycoon. And then he sold it. So he had bought it for $120,000, and he sold it for $6.7 million. So he multiplied his investment 67 times, whereas Mrs. Farnsworth only barely doubled hers. But still, wanted to one last example, and then I'll stop and we can have a little conversation about it. I wanted to share with you this quote from her, which is interesting to me because it gets a little bit to the core of what I want to get to with this lecture. She said, the big glossy magazines polished their terms, I have it here in Italian too, polished their terms and phrases with such patience that the simpler minds came to see the glass box, light enough to float in the air or float in the water, attached to its pillars and enclosing its mystical space. Culture spreads by proclamation. And she quotes Mies here, who had apparently said that. Culture spreads by proclamation. And one gets the impression that if the house had been shaped like a towering banana instead of a resting rectangle, the proclamation would have been just as compelling, right? So she says it's really the critics that make or create our appreciation for the architecture rather than the architecture itself. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I want to share with you another voice, and that is the voice of, I think, a very important woman, Elizabeth Gordon, who edited a magazine, House Beautiful, and she basically criticized the architecture of the international style coming to America for being too obsessed with forms. You have it here. I don't know, can you read it or is it too hard to read it?
It's readable.
It's readable. So she criticized the architects of being too much obsessed with form and not paying enough attention for the needs of the clients who want to live in them, be comfortable. And she published houses. She mentioned in particular Mies van der Rohe, whom she called a threat to the next America. So, his influence is pernicious in America. So I thought that was really quite interesting. And you see here the houses that she would promote in her magazine, House Beautiful, and they are warm and livable, have nice materials. They are not statements of art. They're not as photogenic as the glass house was, but of course last longer, have much fewer problems, and are more inhabitable, right? So that was the point I wanted to make, which I think is hopefully a somewhat important one. I wanted to get to my last example, and sadly, again, the video doesn't play, so I'll take you to the Lakeshore Drive apartments. I don't know why that doesn't work. The first one worked, but to the Lakeshore Drive apartments that many of you are familiar with. Also a glass-enclosed set of apartments. It was called the first glass house as an apartment building. And it looks like this here. And Mies was very proud of having talked the developer into having glass from floor to ceiling on the outside walls. And that was how it was sold. It was very much sold to an upper class clientele, and so that's also before air conditioning. And you can already imagine that the effects were very similar to what happened at the glass house out in Illinois, in Plano, Illinois. And so here's a little view, indisputably beautiful proportions and everything, but problematic in many ways. You see it here, how it's hovering above that wonderful retreated translucent glass box at the bottom. Very beautiful proportions, but it had a lot of problems. I found a wonderful quote from a man, a critic at the time, Peter Blake, who was a German immigrant. He was born as Peter Blach in Berlin, then he came to the United States, was a friend of Mies and always defended him, but at some point he had enough. And he said, he was editor of Architectural Forum, so he had a loud megaphone because a lot of people read Architectural Forum in the United States. And so he said in an article, I want to show you this first. So Mies put up these I-beams on the facade as a form of ornament after the experience of what he had accomplished at the Farnsworth House with this magic construction. He used it here now as a symbol of what was happening structurally inside. So he couldn't show the actual load-bearing structure because you had to fireproof it and enclose it in concrete. So you put a symbol of what was carrying the load on the outside. It's purely ornamental, of course. Many of you have talked about it in your classes, I'm sure. It's a classical example. And so here's the voice of Peter Blake, which I thought was really quite interesting, and that brings me already almost to the end of my presentation. And so Peter Blake said in what I think is a valid criticism, to many critics, it has seemed that Mies is eloquent about the steel cage at the expense of making the space inside the cage work properly in terms of mechanical equipment and indoor climate, right? No air conditioning. Unprotected glass walls can be exquisitely beautiful, but exquisite beauty escapes when glass walls are supported by improvised brown paper lampshades taped to the interior by a sizzling, blinded humanity. Meaning the people in there are sizzling, they're hot, and they're blinded, and they put up brown paper into the windows. Perhaps eventually technology will come to the rescue, he said, in the form of air conditioning. Again, but that end is not yet in sight. For now, it must be the architect who comes to the rescue. So he accuses Mies of basically neglecting his clients. I think I also have a translation here. And so that brings me to what I think is an important point, and I feel we are at a juncture where we look at Mies maybe and his many followers and friends and colleagues and so on, perhaps slightly differently, and that is that we have traditionally judged or maybe given too much emphasis to the photogeneity of architecture, to the imagery, to the way things look in magazines. And of course, if you publish Mies and photograph it well, or any other building, on the day when it's finished and freshly presentable, you present it in a stage that is sort of almost independent from what its usage might look like in the years to come. And we sort of have reduced our understanding of architecture, at least in the sort of mainstream of the discourse and of the canon, to something that I think is somewhat reductive, because we've reduced it to the image and considered architecture as an art form, as a great composition, but not necessarily acknowledged the full range of what architecture needs to accomplish. And I'm sort of interested in the fact that Martin Heidegger already in 1938 noticed when he said the fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as an image. And he pointed that out. And
slide.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm working with two here, so. And so that's Martin Heidegger in 1938. Fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as an image. And Michel de Certeau in the famous Practice of Everyday Life in 1984. And that was before we all had our iPhones bombarding us non-stop with imagery, of course. He says, from television to newspapers, from advertising to all sorts of mercantile epiphanies, our society is characterized by a cancerous growth of vision, which measures everything by its ability to show or be shown. Right? So the emphasis on the image that we use to understand architecture, and I think we have to sort of go beyond that perhaps and try and understand how has it fared over time, how is it inhibited, how comfortable are the people in it, how does it fulfill its function very simply. And so I feel the way we look at architecture is in flux. I love this photograph here by a German photographer, Thomas Rohe, who photographed the Barcelona pavilion as if it was in motion. And I think it's in a way a symbol for how every generation creates a new look at those classic pieces of architecture and a new approach to them. And I was encouraged by this quote from Rafael Moneo, a contemporary Spanish architect, who said, when he talked about the Barcelona pavilion, acknowledging how many different views, here's that blurry image there by Thomas Rohe, how many different views there are towards the Barcelona pavilion. He said, the pavilion is a mirror or kaleidoscope. Can you read this?
Yes.
In which the viewer, the performer, the critic is the new protagonist. Here it is in... That's it. So the pavilion is a mirror or kaleidoscope in which the viewer, the performer, the critic is the new protagonist, meaning we as viewers are the ones who create the image of the pavilion. I want to end on that note. Thank you very much.
Intanto porti saluto del professor Massimo Sardolini, che oggi era impegnato tutto il giorno a Camerino e quindi non poteva partecipare. Ma io spero che questa serie ripetute, al di là del ringraziare il professore per il suo intervento fantastico, che ha messo in evidenza alcune cose che noi sappiamo ma non mettiamo mai in evidenza rispetto a queste tipologie di architettura moderna. Però volevo dire, io spero che questo ciclo ripetuto, un po' maniacale, crei veramente una nuova abitudine a collaborare, a integrare e a creare una relazione vera tra noi e il territorio, che molto spesso non è così idilliaca. Okay? Quindi spero nella nuova abitudine che queste presentazioni possano veramente continuare nel tempo e portare veramente a una reale discussione tra la nostra università e il territorio e la città. Tutto qua, grazie.
Innanzitutto ringrazio Dietrich per la leggerezza, no, con cui ci ha presentato un'opera che normalmente gravida di un'aura importante, no, a volte anche pesante e forse anche leziosa certe volte, un po' troppo. E io ho subito 2 o 3 domande. Immediately, no, 2 o 3 questions. Una a proposito di uno dei grandi temi che sta dietro l'architettura di Mies, che è il tema della griglia. Grid, no? It's a crucial question. E mi sono chiesto durante la tua presentazione, mi è venuto in mente una conferenza che Ellison e Peter Smithson fanno su Mies, invitati da Oswald Matthias Ungerz. In Berlino. E loro fanno presentano, diciamo, una loro lezione su ovviamente l'influenza di Mies nel loro lavoro, che come sappiamo è importante, e mettono nella copertina, Ungerz fa un libricino di questa lezione e sulla copertina c'è un pezzo di griglia ritagliata con la carta millimetrata. You know this paper, millimeters paper, no? Che è un modo per vedere la griglia, diciamo, nel modo più basico, no? Cioè la griglia non è più un disegno bellissimo, perfetto, ma è quello che ognuno di noi può comprare in cartoleria.
Sì.
Quindi questo modo un po' grezzo, mi sono chiesto, allora, cioè, ripensando a questa cosa, sono chiesto, ma la griglia secondo te per Mies era un punto di partenza o un punto di arrivo? No, perché io ho sempre pensato che fosse un punto di partenza,
sì, è vero, sì.
Però diciamo, se il Mies che ci hai fatto vedere oggi è così ambiguo, allora forse le cose sono un po' più complesse.
Sì. Secondo me è un punto di partenza. If I think of Crown Hall, the architecture school at IIT, it was one of his last buildings at IIT. It took a long time to raise the funds, and Mies had developed a grid for IIT for all the classroom buildings that he did before. And then the architecture school came, and he completely abandoned the grid and created something new for the architecture school. So I think the same at the Barcelona pavilion, there's a grid for the travertine plates on the floor, but in key moments he abandons the grid. So the columns are not standing always on the intersection, but they are off. So I think it's a starting point, and then he takes the liberty to do something else that looks better. I think he was driven by a really powerful sense of proportions, and that's how he made his decision. If it looked right, it didn't matter if the grid aligned or not, I think. But there is a sense, and he talks about that. I struggled in the second half of the book with all the American projects because they are so repetitive. One Mies building looks like the next of the high rises and the university buildings. They all look very similar. And so Mies said, I want to create a universal formula for each type, and then we can just repeat it. It has to be the perfect response, and then we just repeat it. And those are done with the help of a module and a grid, and they repeat. But it's a little frustrating for the biographer when you see that, because you think at the same time you have Joe Ponti, or you have Scarpa, or you have Corbusier. They all develop new things for each project, but Mies didn't. He was like monotone, one repetition, one answer for, very similar questions.
La seconda cosa, e poi lascio la parola, facciamo anche una discussione, è su un personaggio che ho sempre cercato di capire qual era veramente il suo rapporto con Mies e qual era il rapporto di Mies con lui, che è Philip Johnson. Noi sappiamo che, ripensando al fatto che nella casa Farnsworth in un secondo momento è stata aggiunta l'aria condizionata, mi viene in mente che quando Rainer Banham parla della glass house di Philip Johnson, dice: guardate che questa glass house funziona non perché c'è il camino che riscalda veramente, ma perché c'è il riscaldamento a pavimento. No? There is a heated floor, the heated floor. Quindi diciamo c'è un sistema che bleffa, no? È un sistema, come dire, non è aria condizionata, ma è un sistema tecnologico nascosto lì dentro. Allora mi sono chiesto, siccome la glass house di Johnson viene prima della casa di Mies, se forse Mies doveva imparare di più da Philip Johnson.
That's a good idea. Yes, that is such an interesting relationship. You're so right, between Philip Johnson's glasshouse and Mies's Farnsworth house. Philip Johnson always acknowledged that he had the idea. He stole the idea from Mies. He would always say that, right? He came to Mies's office, he saw a model of the Farnsworth house, and then he took it, and he was very wealthy, so he was his own client, and he built his own version. And it's so different in so many ways. You're right. It sits on the ground. It has a heated floor, and it has the Farnsworth house is like this. It's a little difficult to inhabit. The glass house is more like this, so you have more space to move around. It's a little easier to inhabit. And most importantly, Mrs. Farnsworth, she always complained that obviously in this one room were all the functions. There was the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, pretty much. And she was embarrassed in the bedroom, somebody might look from the distance, And Philip Johnson, without talking much about it, he built a separate bedroom just a few meters away, a brick box, no windows, just, and he would go there to sleep, so he didn't have that problem. It was not monofunctional didn't combine all the function that Mies combined. But I think the conversation, in many ways, the glasshouse by Johnson is a better building because it's more inhabitable and it has much fewer problems. So it's an interesting conversation between the two and between different approaches to architecture.
You think that has to do with the fact of being German and American?
That's a great idea. That's a great.
You are in the perfect position to answer this question.
Exactly. And I think I'm sort of atypical by now for a German, but one could sort of say that, of course, the Mies's building is much more radical and consequential. One idea, brought all the way to the end radically, whereas Johnson made compromises. There's a wonderful interview where he says, Mies came to my glass house. He's being interviewed in the glass house, and Mies asked him, so how did you construct the ceiling? And Johnson said, well, just like all the ceilings around here are constructed. I put in some wooden beams and some straw, and we patched it up and then put stucco over it, and fine, it doesn't matter for me. And Mies said, according to Johnson, you should be ashamed of yourself, because, of course, the structure had to be perfectly constructed following an inner logic, even if you didn't see it from the outside. And so one could perhaps say that's a very radical German approach, but I don't know. But
La prima domanda è una curiosità che già ti avevo anticipato qualche ora fa, che è anche legata un po' a delle curiosità dei miei studenti, il rapporto con Lili Reich.
Sì. That's so interesting that you brought this up, because there is a big movement underway in Berlin. I get asked all the time, and I think it's also that there are still family members who want to make sure that Lili Reich gets acknowledged more. The Museum of Modern Art in New York has 1,000 drawings by Lili Reich that have not been properly catalogued. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think they had a very good working relationship, and they talked all the time, right?
Yeah.
So there are very few documents where you can really say, this is Lili Reich, this is Mies. You can't separate it very easily, because it was almost symbiotic. And when Mies has left, and she is in Berlin, she dies very young. She had a terrible fate at the end of her years, And Mies was not nice to her. He was not a nice man. He kind of worked with her, but then he was in America and didn't really want too much to do with her. They have a little bit of a correspondence which has survived, and she organized his office, etc. But he does send her the catalog of his first big exhibition, 1947, in New York, and she gets it 5 days before she dies. Very ill, poor, right after the end of the war. She lost everything, a bomb hit her apartment, everything is gone. So it's a tragic story, but I think it will be difficult to isolate her as an independent, overlooked artist, which is, of course, what everyone hopes, Like, let's do a big Lili Reich exhibition and finally bring her into the spotlight. It's not so easy, because the work that she does when Mies has left shows that the collaboration isn't ongoing, and it's not as strong as what happened when they were both playing off each other and were a very good collaborative, symbiotic team. So that's the problem. But in the letters that have survived, she's often deferring to Mies. Let's ask Mies, he has the final word, And so he, however, so she always defers to him and gives him credit, but he never gave her much credit, which is not nice. In the book, the catalog, 1947, Mies van der Rohe, Museum of Modern Art, that she receives, she's not even mentioned. Briefly, Philip Johnson mentioned her in the introduction, that's it.
E un'altra curiosità era il rapporto con gli studenti negli Stati Uniti, no? Ci sono tutte queste foto di, come si chiama, Frank Scherzer, no? Di questi gruppi di studenti nelle revisioni. Che rapporto lui aveva? Cosa pretendeva? Quali erano i suoi punti fermi, dei suoi corsi universitari? Prendere di più l'aspetto tecnologico, compositivo, della distribuzione interna? Hai trovato del materiale nuovo per il libro su questo aspetto?
That's such a very good question, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say that I haven't found new material there, but I can only repeat some of the stories that I mentioned and that I learned, but others had found already, that Mies for the first few years he didn't speak English very well at all.
Okay.
So I think his English was even worse than my Italian. But so his critiques, there's a man called James Ingo Fried who studied with Mies, and there's this great interview, and the interviewer asked him, so what did Mies say, And he said, well, I would come and be very nervous. The big Mies would look at my drawings, and then he would not say a word. He would be very quiet, silent. And Mies would puff his cigar and look at this drawing. And the student would sit there, wondering what's going on. And they would go on for a long, long time. It probably seemed longer than it was, but maybe 5-10 minutes, And then finally, Mies would take a cigar and get up and say, yeah, and move on to the next. That's what James Ingo Fried said in an interview. So I think he was not a very detail-oriented teacher. And I also think that he didn't sort of come up with too many new ideas. In these photos that you mentioned by Scherschel, right? You see that the students at IIT, they had to design the same courtyard house compositions that all looked like the Barcelona pavilion that he had already his students at the Bauhaus when he was director at the Bauhaus from 1930 to 1933. They did exactly the same studies, And I feel these were houses for very wealthy people with a big piece of land and a huge living room and glass enclosed, very beautiful. But this is the time of the Depression. And he has a lot of communist students at the Bauhaus, right? And I think he was a little tone deaf to what was needed at that moment. He was just involved in his idea of distributing space and great materials and whatever, but he wasn't necessarily attuned to the needs of the time. And he continues that same teaching at IIT. But then the older he got, the less involved he got. So there are many stories that he would only come in for a little bit in the afternoon to the studio and then leave again. So he wasn't deeply involved in his teaching, I think.
The last curiosity I have to ask you, because we recently celebrated the 80th anniversary of Vanicola's, with 8 years last month.
Oh, wow.
And next year will be the 50th anniversary of the office of the foundation of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture.
Yeah.
That, as you know, has been very influenced by Van der Rohe, Colas itself, and he did also projects on Mies buildings in Chicago. So what is your opinion about a superstar that starts to copy or to reinvent another superstar many decades after?
Yeah, that's I had no idea he was 80 already. That's crazy. Colas. But we had a discussion earlier that architects either get very, very old, and I hope Colas is one of them. Philip Johnson was like 99 or something when he died, and Oscar Niemeyer was 102, I think. Right?
Yes.
And so there are many other examples. Or they die a terrible death, like Carlo Scarpa. Do you know? Louis Kahn, that's another great example. But that's another story. So Colas hopefully will be very old. But what I liked about his approach to me is that in a way he always opened him up and made him basically what I tried to show here, this sort of very single focused vision that Mies had on certain formal ideas and very repetitiveness. Colas opened up both with the building on IIT's campus, which I think is quite brilliant, where he put in a new grid but immediately questioned it and changed it. And Mies was always thinking in 2 dimensions, right? Everything is sort of horizontal. He didn't think much about 3-dimensional space, but Colas, of course, does. So suddenly there's a hole in the ground, you go down, you go up, and then the perfection of Mies, when you think of what he did at the Farnsworth House, this welding and polishing and painting, Colas does the opposite. He puts up material that is sort of slapped up and half finished, and he likes that half finished look. So he likes process and showing traces of the workmanship. So he took Mies, but then questioned him. And it starts perhaps with his comment on the Barcelona pavilion, which he did at the Triennale in Milan in '86 or something like that,
right.
where he did the same thing. Instead of the pristine look. He took it and made a curve out of it because he had a space in that fascist building in the Triennale building in Milan, which is curved. Was that Muzio? Muzio. Yeah, Muzio, exactly. So he squeezed it in there, and then he put all kinds of bodybuilding equipment in there and said, we need to use this space rather than having it so pristine without people. So that was pretty cool. So he's really humanizing these.
Yeah.
Il dettaglio dei fori con la saldatura è tipicamente da designer.
Sì.
No? Okay. Quindi dov'era il suo limite tra essere architetto e essere designer? Nel senso, i suoi edifici sono architettura o prodotti per vivere?
Sì. Oh. That's exactly in a nutshell, right? The question. So, should architecture be lived in, or should it be a design object? Exactly. And I hope we're and I'm thinking of your book, which I think talks exactly about this appreciation for the elements and qualities of architecture that make it livable. And I think that's exactly the point where I think it's important that we rethink our appreciation for those masters of architecture and their single view. And you're absolutely right. I think it's a question between design, art, or architecture, which should, of course, be about inhabitation and comfort and protection and shelter and all of those elements. Yes. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes.
Okay.
Ho letto che inizialmente Mies avrebbe dovuto fare la casa patchwork in mattoni e cemento, ma siccome c'era la guerra e i cementifici erano stati trasformati in dovevano fare acciaierie e avrebbe dovuto farla in cemento armato, però per il fatto che non si trovava il cemento ha dovuto fare con l'acciaio.
Oh.
Però questa io l'ho letta, non so se è vero.
Yeah, I must admit I have not seen proof of that. A few years ago they found all the material of the court case when he sues Mrs. Farnsworth and the judge. Oh, it's easy. Oh, maybe you can translate. Yeah. So, and the judge asked him, and then he said, "Well, initially we wanted to do it as a student project for Mrs. Farnsworth, and so we thought of using very simple material, concrete and plywood, and so I think that's what you're referring to. But I don't think there are any drawings. It was just something he told the judge when he asked him that it was meant to be a student project, and then basically it sort of got out of hand, and that's why it became so expensive, right? That first, because she sued him, or they sued each other in the end, and she said it's so much more expensive than what you had initially quoted. And so he says, well, we had thought it would be a student project with cement and plywood, but I've not heard the story that there was no cement available, I think.
Cioè, è vero che c'era inizialmente il progetto di realizzarlo, ma lui non sa, non ha mai sentito che il passaggio all'acciaio è dovuto al fatto che non fosse possibile accedere al cemento. The same the relationship between Lily Reich and Mies was more or less the same as Le Corbusier and Charlotte Perriand.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, I think. Although I would probably, to be totally honest, I would say that I think the independent designs that I've seen from Charlotte Perriand are stronger than the independent designs I've seen from Lily Reich. This is always the comparison. I think Charlotte Perriand was rightly rediscovered and presented as an independent artist, and Corbusier treated her very badly. There's no doubt about it. I'm not sure one can do the same thing with Lily Reich. I think they were just such a good team and talked a lot and worked together, but to separate them out like that is not so easy. Yeah.
Dice il confronto è interessante, però indubbiamente secondo lui Charlotte Perriand ha avuto un'importanza molto maggiore.
Pare che
e dice probabilmente Lily Reich diciamo, non sarebbe all'altezza di una valutazione così importante per quello che ha fatto da sola.
La Reich sceglieva i tessuti per le sedie.
he said that Dietrich chose the fabric.
Dal Bauhaus praticamente questa
She came from Bauhaus.
Yes, she had a career long before she met Mies, and she was very involved in the Werkbund, and she picks the fabrics. And I think, there are sort of quotes where they talk when they designed the House Wolf together. And she always says, let's ask Mies for the final word, but she defers to him all the time, but she does pick a lot of fabrics and colors. And in the she was sort of known behind the scenes as being more courageous and more adventurous than Mies. So there's correspondence when the Barcelona pavilion is being made and the government officials say, let's be careful about Lily Reich, she does wild things and we don't want to do this. So Mies is probably more controllable than Reich, so she was known as someone who was more adventurous, but it's tricky.
Lei era famosa per essere una persona molto
di carattere,
e quindi preferivano avere Mies che era più controllabile, diciamo, da questo punto di vista.
You just got the point when you say that Mies was an artist, because the point is the relationship between art and architecture. And if we think which kind of art Mies followed, it was abstractism.
Right.
So it's important to focus on abstractism because it's an anthropological revolution, seen from Mondrian and Malevich. And so the form of architecture must express an idea, not a function. This is why Mies van der Rohe said the form has nothing to do with architecture, because it's not a question of form, it's a question of ideas. And I think the architectures of Mies are not to be seen as livable, but thinkable. This is a completely another thing. It's a conceptual art. And so the value is in that, not in the materiality of architecture. That is the difference between him and Philip Johnson. Johnson was just a pro. Was a good architect, but just a professional. And the difference also with Renkulas, that is an architect of entertainment and is not an architect of ideas.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a good point to make. Question is, what about the people who lived in those houses, right? So of course, it's a contradiction there. Of course, it's abstract art and. Such one has to say that Farnsworth House as a sculpture is very early. If you think when Solowit makes his first white frame sculptures, that's like 20 years later or something. So it's as a piece of sculpture, it's really very interesting. Early abstract art, you have a very good point there, I think. But architecture, of course, is meant to house people, right? So can you do that?
The eternal contrast between the ideas and the reality of humanity.
Right. Yeah.
We have to accept as they are.
Yeah. So, I think that's a good, sort of compromise we can live with. Yeah.
Excuse me, I would really like to understand how was the saldatura a spina, the structural poetry method that you were talking about. How were these pillars supporting the weight of the building?
That's a very good question. I think it's a little uncertain. I wouldn't be surprised if one day, the whole thing collapses, because it's these connections. You have the holes, right, and then you have a little additional steel.
You go back to the.
Oh yes. And sorry, the other one. Something like this. This is just something I found on the internet. So, and then there were holes in the I-beam, and then you have to bring in the welding torch and heat it all up and melt it and add a little additional melted steel to fill the hole. But it's very hard to measure how deep you go into the next layer. So it mixes it all up, but it's a very tenuous and unpredictable connection. You're absolutely right. So he took a big risk just for the effect of making it look magically glued together. And I think that's interesting and in a way contradictory to what we know about him as a rationalist and as a structural architect, it's really supporting what you just said. He is an abstract artist, and that's why he went for that length. And Mrs. Farnsworth supported it for a very long time. They had the design ready in 1945 as a sketch, but then it took 6 years until it was finished. And then they had a court case. He sued her, she sued him, and that took another 4 years to be finished. And Mies was very nervous that he would lose his license or get into terrible trouble because of malpractice, But he already became famous, and they had all these articles in the newspapers praising him. Peter Blake, whom I quoted, still on his side at that point, published what a great architect he was. And I think that influenced the judges too. And finally they made a compromise. But he paid more. He had to pay his lawyer, whereas she was a doctor, and her lawyer worked for her for free because he was a patient. He was a patient of hers, right? So, but that's a great question. I think that's a really interesting point. We don't really know how well the connections. You can't look in there, right? So we have no idea how tight it actually works. So that would be something if one day it would just collapse.
Thank you, Dietrich, for your speech. I couldn't imagine a better start for this initiative than Kill the Master, an icon like Mies van der Rohe. It's stunning. I love it. An easy, probably banal question. Why Mies is Mies? Because him architecture was a manifesto for him idea, or the aesthetic of him architecture was so great, or the disruptive approach with new material, contemporary material of that decade. What makes Mies so important for the history of architecture?
That's a very good question. I always ask that myself, right, writing this book, and people have asked me that. It's such a clear question and so hard to answer in a way. But I think first of all, he was very good at promoting himself, promoting his work, making sure that friends of his wrote positive articles about him in the newspapers. And Mrs. Farnsworth quoted him by saying, culture spreads by proclamation. Meaning if the newspaper says this is a great building, then most people believe it. And so, this is one way of making sure you get a lot of appreciation. But I think his sort of central gospel of great simplicity was a very good fit for the chaos of the Weimar Republic. The first democracy was a total chaos, lots of governments, lots of problems. And then the second half of his career, again, this sort of stern simplicity of the buildings that I showed briefly that he built in the United States was also a good fit for this sort of giddy post-war boom in the United States, where you had a lot of money and the economy was flourishing, all kinds of stuff were happening. And America basically solidified its global reach as an imperial power, and so this sort of heavy, solid architecture, the emphasis on steel, on industrial might, that also somehow hit a nerve at the time that helped to make him a public figure and greatly appreciated and so on. But he also had clients who pushed for that and manipulated the media. The photographs that you mentioned, or maybe you had Frank Scherschel, they were done for an article in Life magazine, and that was pushed for by a man called Samuel Bronfman, who had a huge empire of liquor, Seagram, right? Seagram, and he had made his money by smuggling liquor from Canada into the United States during Prohibition. So people considered him a bit sort of immoral, So he wanted to push his reputation and built a beautiful skyscraper on Park Avenue and had it published everywhere with a lot of money for public relations. So I think public relations plays a certain role, and a good fit, a sense for what this time wanted also is something that Mies had, so he pushed for that. But it's a very good question, and I don't have a definite final answer. But I have a feeling if we sort of are in the process that some of us think we are of reconsidering whom we have honored in the canon of architecture, we might reconsider his role as well and maybe bring others to the forefront who were more aware of the needs of social housing and the needs of comfort and so on, and were less abstract artists than Mies was. But I think he'll always be an interesting figure to love or hate or contrast with. But thanks, very good question.
Ne approfitto sì un attimo, ho visto la sollecitazione, parlo in italiano così mi comprendono anche loro. E tu hai studiato questo rapporto tra le facciate con illuminazione diurna e illuminazione notturna, no? Mm-hmm. Negli anni 30-40, quando Mies forma un po' la sua architettura, c'erano questi progetti e realizzazioni di Mendelssohn, tipo per i Kaufhaus, cioè per i grandi magazzini in Germania, per gli Schocken, no? Dove lui studia lo stesso progetto che però ha due, tra virgolette, facciate, no? Per il giorno e per la notte, con la luce artificiale. Mies pensa la stessa cosa, soprattutto negli Stati Uniti, no? I progetti per Chicago, oppure no, cioè per lui è importante avere due situazioni diurne e notturne, creare una sorta di landmark anche nel disegno della città, oppure no? Cioè,
I think Mies was very lucky in some ways that he found Philip Johnson. It's interesting, Philip Johnson actually talked about this and he said Mies was terrible at lighting. He said, look at the Tugendhat house at night, it makes no sense. He had these beautiful lamps in the ceiling by Paul Henningsen, Danish designer, very cool guy, but they have nothing to do with the seats, or they're just on a rhythm, in the ceiling, they don't work with the seating arrangement. So Johnson said he was terrible at thinking about lighting at night, but he introduced him to a man who made the lighting for Philip Johnson's glass house, and a man called Richard Kelly. I actually did a book on him. He's a great lighting designer, and so he helped to make the Seagram building and the Lakeshore Drive apartments and several others look good at night. But it was a lighting designer who came onto Mies's team and was paid for him, who did the downlighting so that it looks like the building emerges from a pool of light. So Mies had some help there. I think that was essential, and Philip Johnson recognized that, and so he introduced him. Yeah.
Una sola al volo, il rapporto con Phyllis Lambert, visto che abbiamo parlato della Reich anche di un'altra donna.
Was it my report with her? Or
no,
oh yeah, so we've often met, of course. She's unique and has moved a lot in the world of architecture. She worked with me. She was the one who told her father, who had already chosen a designer, but her father, Samuel Bronfman, the one who made the money on Seagram whiskey and many others, he knew nothing about architecture, of course, and he had imagined something like a baronial Scottish castle type thing that he wanted on Park Avenue, and she wrote him this long letter and said, no, you cannot do this. You have to hire Mies, Corbusier, I think she had Les Cars and a few others that, it has to be a really good building. And so he said, okay, you pick the architect. So she picked the architect and then was very much involved in the design of the building and really fell in love with architecture, studied architecture, did a few buildings that look totally Miesian in Montreal, right? And she has been always very nice and very supportive. And what impresses me most is that she inherited a lot of money from her father. So it's all the money that comes from Seagram whiskey and importing whiskey to the United States, like really a big amount of money. And she did, I think, the best thing you can do with a huge amount of money. She made it her passion and her mission to buy every single book that had ever been written on architecture in the history of mankind. It's an incredible idea, right? So she went and bought Renaissance treatises here in Italy. She got all the, she had a whole team, and then all the Bauhaus books and everything from all over the world, and put it in an architecture library. It's called the Canadian Centre of Architecture. It's the best architecture library in the world, all paid for with whiskey money, which I think is great. And so she really made a difference. I've spent a lot of time there. They have an incredible collection, and that's really wonderful. We're still in touch. She is like 90,
Yes.
2, 4, something like that, you know. So, and I just sent her my book,
Yes,
so
yes.
I'm a little nervous because, as you can tell, my book is a little critical, and she fell in love with Mies and his architecture, not in a romantic sense, but you know, she loved him, and so my book is a little critical, and I'm a little nervous. I'm waiting for an email because I think she got it probably yesterday or so. I just sent it off. What she is saying about it, she might not like it, but we'll see. But she has been very friendly and supportive. I've had her twice over to talk to my students, and so she's great. Have you met her, or has she?
Yes.
Yeah.
She did a beautiful book on the Seagram.
Yes,
a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I reviewed it very
She
nicely.
presented in Rome, actually.
Oh, she did. Yeah. No, she's quite something. Really full of energy. Yeah. Wonderful.
Right.
E noi volevamo fare un omaggio con la nostra
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
t-shirt unica ambassador.
Some football. Very nice. Thank you. I'm honored.
It's a minimal enough.
Less is more.
And I seriously think your architecture school is so nice and incredible. It beats Crown Hall.
And then the beautiful bag.
Okay. Also. Nice. Thank you.
E facciamo un applauso al nostro ospite. E così chiudiamo il primo appuntamento.